I will. I I might actually like skim some of this because I feel like some of the things that we talked about were I already covered them. So hopefully it's not going to be too long of an evening for all of us. Okay, so let me start by entertaining this concept of foreign policy, right? This is sort of a good definition that you see on the screen, which is ideas or actions designed by policymakers to solve a problem or promote some change in the policies, attitudes, or actions of another state or states, in non-state actors, in the international economy, or in the physical environment of the world. So I think there are a couple of things that we need to pay attention here. It's not just actions, but it's also ideas. So it's the tangible and the intangible. And it's also not necessarily relations between states, but it could also be relations between a state and a non-state actor. So let's say what's right now transpiring in the Middle East and what we're sort of putting forward as sort of U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Hamas, as well as, you know, the state of Israel. So these are all part and parcel of U.S. foreign policy, in addition to the international economy, right? As I will mention later on, a big area of research in foreign policy analysis and international relations research concerns economic sanctions, right? And there's a whole huge literature and growing literature on A, whether sanctions work, B, if they do, how they work, and or why they do not work. So that's also all part and parcel of foreign policy studies. So I pose these three questions on the screen. You know, was the Iran nuclear deal a foreign policy issue for the United States? Now, judging by that definition that I've just talked about, yes, of course, right? Like it's an idea and an action that the United States designed with, with the P5 and Germany to promote some change in the policies of the Iranian government concerning their, nuclear advancements. But what about the Israeli disengagement from Gaza? And I did not, I had prepared this presentation prior to October 7th. So now that I see it, it's unfortunately timely. But the Israeli disengagement from Gaza, whether it was a foreign policy issue for Israel or not, is open to debate, right? Because ultimately, when up until 2005, after 1967, when Israel annexed, or I shouldn't say annexed, but occupied Gaza and basically took it away from Egypt at the time, was this part and parcel of Israel proper? Not necessarily, but it was a particular piece of land that Israel controlled. So does that make Israel policy toward Gaza a foreign policy issue or a domestic policy issue, right? So, and also the disengagement, the voluntary removal of Israel's military and settlers from Gaza, some 10,000 of them at the time, back in 2005. Was that a foreign policy issue? I think it could be discussed in either way, and that's also another justification for why trying to isolate domestic politics from foreign policy is futile, right? Like it's pointless, really. And then, was Brexit a foreign policy issue for the UK? Absolutely it was, but then there's also a lot of domestic political implications and public policy approaches that studied Brexit, because ultimately it was the UK deciding to disengage from an organization that it was a part of. So along with the foreign policy implications, it was a decoupling of economic structures. So that also has to do with the domestic politics side of it. The other thing I want to talk about is how there are different ways in which we understand foreign policy. So one such understanding is, or what we would call conceptualization of foreign policy. So how do we define it and what goes into this term? Number one, we could think about foreign policy as the pursuit of objectives beyond the jurisdiction of the state. So this is pretty much self-explanatory. It's, we're focusing on the foreign aspect of it. So anything that's happening outside the borders of a state has to do with its foreign policy. But also, we can think about policy as aspiration, policy as strategy, for instance, right? And so it's not just about the tangible who did what to whom of it, but also what we want to achieve in the world, what's our goal, and all of those sort of vision, mission kind of debates. Like the national security strategy, which is a sort of a public document, right? If you Google it, you'll see it. It's produced every 4 years, I think. And I encourage you to look at the NSS that's published by the White House that outlines how the U.S. sees the world and how the U.S. thinks about its foreign policy goals and principles and the methods in which that it envisions attaining those goals. Policy can also be construed as action or inaction or non-action, right? What you do is part and parcel of your foreign policy, right? We talked about ideas and actions, but also what you don't do or what you choose not to do is also part and parcel of your foreign policy, right? So for instance, whenever, and again, like this is, I always give this example when I talk about this particular point, but now that with what's happening in the Middle East, it's so I can't help but sort of think about what's happening in the Middle East, which is, so the United States stands by Israel, right? And in this particular instance, I think the US absolutely should, right? Considering this sort of horrendous attack perpetrated by Hamas. And then, so that's like what we do, right? Like that's policy as action. The US goes out, Biden visits Israel, Blinken visits Israel, and we say, we stand by you, you're not alone, all that. At the same time, when Palestine or the Palestinian Authority bids for statehood at the UN level, the US's official position, and by way of being a veto power, a veto player at the Security Council, if it vetoes it, it's a no-go. The US position is to always deny or abstain or sort of not act on that particular bid. Similarly, a policy as non-action would be sort of choosing not to condemn a particular actor for an atrocity that they might have committed. And of course, here I have in mind Saudi Arabia's brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist, and the US never actually officially condemning Saudi Arabia for this atrocity. Now, replace Saudi Arabia with any other authoritarian regime, I believe that we would be sort of saying this forcefully, that this is a violation of basic human rights and a brutal murder at that, a state-sanctioned murder. But then the US never actually said anything about it. That's part of US foreign policy. And then finally, policy as a standard for behavior. And here actually I have like this example I gave about Palestine and Palestinian statehood and U.S. position on that makes a lot more sense actually, because like that's our sort of line, right? Like that's something that, you know, the U.S. Will always veto Palestinian bid for statehood under current circumstances. Now, hopefully that might change at some point, but you know, we won't know. So what we think about is how policy provides you with the rules and guidelines, like a template, and it limits your options as to what's plausible, what's doable, and what's not plausible, and what are within the realm of possibility, and what are absolute sort of, you know, no-goes. Okay. So why don't we just call this IR and go home? Well, actually, we're home, but you know, go to bed or something. So the reason why is, like I said in the interview previously, which is we think about these states as like these neat pink boxes that I have on the screen. And, you know, state A does something to state B responds, and so on and so forth. SPIA argues that states are not the actors. It's the actors inside the state. Those are the actors, and those are the individuals or the organizations or the units that we should be focusing on to understand why state A is behaving the way it does towards state B, and why state B is responding to it in the way that it does. And so this kind of unpacking or sort of opening up the black box, that's something that you'll see repeatedly in this literature, argues that we should move away from what we call actor general theories, such as, you know, if I know many of you have majored in political science as an undergrad. So actor general theories would be stuff like realism or neorealism, right? Every state, according to these kinds of major theories, every state is expected to behave in the same way when they face, you know, same circumstances, right? So like states will always try to maximize their power, or states will always end up in a security dilemma. Like when they see other states increasing their military capabilities, they will treat that as a threat to their own, and they will sort of respond in kind. Like those are actor general theories. Who the actor is makes no difference. FPA people would argue that we should really focus on actor-specific explanations, which means who the actor is really matters for how the actor acts. And so what then the foreign policy scholarship does is, again, opening up this black box and looking at who's making up the government, who are the leaders, what are the political parties, who are the players in that sort of political landscape, and how are bureaucracies interfacing them, how is the media interfacing them, or the military, or the sort of the military industrial complex, and so on and so forth. And so what we're really trying to understand is how these units, actor-specific units, are acting in foreign policy. The other thing, you know, so, and we don't even stop there, right? Like I said, in my own work, we also sort of go at the level of the human agent, and we look at how these individual leaders work within these structures, and then work with each other. And then these structures are not even at the domestic level or sort of confined to these institutions like bureaucracies or political parties or the legislature, but these are also shaped by these sort of bigger, broader structural factors like your capabilities, right? Whether you have a big military or a small military, and so on and so forth. What your geography is, right? It's impossible to really understand foreign policy without taking into consideration that country's geography. The economy, right? What you can spend on determines your foreign policy goals, and ultimately your foreign policy actions. Your alliances, who are your friends and who are your competitors? What's your culture like in terms of the core values and principles that shape your society and shape your your country, and that obviously also has some influence over how these decision makers operate. And so all of this is useful because, like I said, it really puts a lot of flesh around this idea of Washington, for instance, right? When you start to pay attention to all of these different things, what the United States, for instance, currently is doing or how it is responding to the attack on Israel, and also the hospital attack today in Palestine, all of that has a lot of all of what you see on the screen has a lot to do with how those responses are being devised. And so what we explain in FPA then can be thought of in three different ways. Number one, we study actions, inactions, and indecisions, and also ideas, right? That's something that I should have highlighted. We also study processes, right? So we don't just look at the end product, which may be a decision to, support. I think just before I joined the Zoom, the US agreed to send like 100 million or something like that of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Like that's the outcome, right? That's the action. But also, or I should say that's the action, but also there's a process that leads up to that action, right? How did the interagency sort of get to that point? And how did the policymakers decide on this ultimate decision, right? I would assume that there were different options. There are pros and cons to each of the different options, and so what that process looked like. And then finally, that's what I mean by outcome. Now that the United States, or any other country for that matter, has a foreign policy behavior, right? The country acts on something, the government acts on something. What are the consequences of that action, right? What are the outcomes of that policy? So these are the three different ways in which we think about foreign policy, and what we like our dependent variable, right? What is it that we're trying to explain in this line of work? This is another way in which we can visualize this. So foreign policy decision making and foreign policy behavior are the two components of this research area, right? The decision making is focusing on the process, and oftentimes it focuses on the interactions between domestic actors and how they were thinking about foreign policy and how they were designing it and devising it and also implementing it. And then the behavior is the actual behavior that let's say extending military aid or condemning Hamas. That is the ultimate behavior that we see that transpiring between a state and, let's say in this case, a non-state actor. Okay. Any questions so far? Or any thoughts?
I do have one quick question.
Yes, please, Sarah.
This is Sarah. Yeah. This is something that I've kind of thought and wondered about a lot ever since, obviously, the war between Israel and Hamas broke out. The United States and its foreign policy towards, in regards to Israel, how did the U.S. become, so unequivocal in its support for the country?
I mean, that's a good question, and honestly, like, I won't be able to answer it here because I teach this over the course of like 2 weeks in my Middle East course, but there's social reasons, there are political reasons, there are all sorts of reasons for why the United States has such a sort of a deep entrenched special relationship with Israel, and I think it's expected. Like if that's the case, then I think the U.S. is, and it is the case that the U.S. talks about this sort of historical relationship with Israel and special relationship with Israel. Then I think it actually did the right thing to do. Like the right thing for it to do was to sort of come out strongly in support for Israel, also considering the fact that Hamas, it is a political party in Gaza, but as far as the EU and the US is concerned, it's a terrorist group, right? And so there's also that particular angle, right? Like it's like the US is condemning a terrorist attack on an ally. So, well, actually, Israel is not technically an ally because we don't have a defense pact with them, but it's sort of a non-treaty ally. That's what we would call them, technically speaking. Yes, Jim, go ahead.
Yes, I find this fascinating because actually in my curriculum, I have an elective class on foreign policy studies in which we examine the history of the United States through its interactions in foreign policy. One of the things that I try to get my students to do is analyze. And for example, when we look later on this year, when we get into the aspects of the Cold War, the post-nuclear, post-World War II nuclear age, one of the things I try to get my students to do is to analyze the Truman Doctrine and whether or not it was, one, successful, and two, even advisable as a United States foreign policy. Do you think that's worth doing in a class, in a high school class like that?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. That was a major foreign policy strategy, right, for the United States. That was part of the containment policy, and that really helped rebuild, along with Marshall Plan, right? That was basically the reason why Europe rebuilt itself from the ground up, including these more sort of not core but peripheral European countries like Turkey. Yeah. So I think it's absolutely important to understand that and to understand how post-war US influence and post-war US influence in the world, and particularly in the transatlantic region, what's the what's the background to that, all the way sort of to today, right? So I think that's very important to tell, and I might come back to this. I might come back to this later, okay. But there are a couple of other people who are raising their hands, so I'll turn to them if that's okay, Jim. Yeah. We have Josh and Nick.
Right. So I was curious, looking back at, when you're talking about what issues are foreign policy and not, do most issues today, the news likes to say, oh, this is a domestic thing, oh, this is a foreign thing. Don't most issues follow some kind of like a continuum, like a spectrum where it's kind of, it can be, you could argue it one way or the other?
I think so. And I think I don't think it was like this maybe 50 years ago, right? But now I think given these domestic political trends, and not just peculiar to the US, but to the world for the most part, right? Like polarization, populism, all of these are deeply domestic dynamics, but they are inevitably shaping how these states also conduct foreign policy. And so one of the things that so I get asked quite a well, especially around election time, I got asked quite a bit about like Turkish politics and foreign policy, and around this past summer and then the summer prior to that, when Finland and Sweden's NATO bids were sort of stonewalled by Turkey, you know, they were asking, like, I had some media interviews and folks were asking me about, okay, so why is Turkey doing this? And that there are like immutable domestic political considerations and concerns that shape how Turkey is behaving in NATO, also with respect to its bilateral relationship with the United States. And so I think you're absolutely right. Like this sort of clear line between domestic politics and foreign policy is, I mean, it doesn't exist. And a lot of the stuff that, like a lot of behaviors and a lot of what states do in the foreign policy realm have domestic driving forces, or motivations might be deeply domestic, as in the case of most of Turkish foreign policy these days. And also what takes place domestically has direct implications for a country's foreign policy, such as this current speakership issue that Congress is going through.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Nick, I think your hand was also up. Do you still want to?
Yes. I basically had a question about like how the military can be used as a foreign policy like action, if that really quantifies as one, like, because they kind of like intermingle, right? Because they have to use the military a little bit, maybe to influence foreign policy. Like in this instance with Israel, like they're projecting, the U.S. is projecting power by moving all these ships into the Mediterranean to kind of prevent Iran and other actors from trying to act on Israel. So like, what's your opinion of using military as like a foreign policy action to kind of prevent other things from going on?
I mean, so I think it was Karl von Clausewitz, right, who said war is a continuation of politics through other means. It's a tool, and in countries where civil military relations are organized as dictated by democratic rules and principles, the military is the what do you call, foot soldier, right? The civilian decision makers, they plan, and then the military executes. Like the military could offer their own input as to what's plausible or not, but at the end of the day, it's the military's job is to implement the civilian order. And like, as far as military being a tool, it is a tool in the toolbox, right? And it's up to the policymaker to decide if so when to draw that card and put it on the table. And if you do it too prematurely, that might create more danger and threat than you would want. If you do it late, then it might be redundant. I don't know. But so what if you take foreign policy analysis with me, there is a paper on the German decision-making process into the EU military force that was going to be deployed to the Congo back in mid-2000s, I think, like 2005. And there, the paper sort of traces the multiple decisions about how the German contribution would look like. Like, is Germany going to send troops, or is Germany going to do this or that? And there are political considerations for it. There are strategic sort of, military strategic considerations for it. So all of those things feed into, all of those things make up the foreign policy decision-making process, right? So, ultimately what we see in the news, like I said, explained before, what we see in the news is, the US Navy is, progressing in the Eastern Mediterranean. But the backstory is, how did that option compare to all these other options that were on the table? And how did the government get to that decision of, moving the fleet into the Eastern Mediterranean? Okay, I will pause on the questions for just a minute, but please keep those hands raised so I can, like, the next time we break, we can take those questions. Let me talk about a couple of research areas, and I will go through them relatively fast. So, like I said, one of the things that I work on is, or sort of the bread and butter of actually what I do is domestic politics of foreign policy. So what we're studying then is things like, how do political parties influence foreign policy, right? Or how certain party families or certain groups of parties have different policy preferences. Can we come up with a spectrum, or can we come up with a policy landscape where certain parties prefer certain types of policies over others? And this goes back to sort of this perennial debate over, guns versus butter, which are, what types of parties are foreign policy hawks, what are foreign policy doves, and how does that shape a country's foreign policy depending on which parties or which combination of parties make up the executive branch or have extraordinary power in the legislative branch, where bills over troop deployment will have to come, and they will have to debate this out, and so on and so forth. I study specifically coalition governments within this sort of domestic politics of foreign policy work, and coalitions are in the parliamentary democratic universe. Different political parties come together, and they form the executive branch, and they run the government. This is fundamentally different from presidential systems where there's a president. The president has their own cabinet that they handpick, and it's basically the president calls the shots. What we see in the parliamentary systems is that, especially in Europe, for instance, like 90% of post-Second World War governments are coalition governments. So you have like this conglomeration of political parties, which may be coming from various different parts of the political spectrum. How do they interact with each other, and how do they interact with their parliaments to engage in international behavior? That's something that I study, and I wrote a book on it. So if you, I think there is you guys are, if you are ever in Springfield, that sort of window case on the third floor of our building, I think I have a copy of my book over there. The other thing I mentioned was about economic sanctions, right? How do they originate? Why do countries use that as a form of stick, right, to influence other countries' behaviors? And do they work? And if so, how? And then the last, I shouldn't say last, but another research area focuses on public opinion, right? There is a long-standing argument that the public does not matter for foreign policy because they do not care about foreign policy, and they are not informed about foreign policy, and that the idea is that voters are mere cue takers, right? We repeat what our elected officials tell us, and we do not formulate opinions or inform ourselves outside of what we hear from the elites. Over time, especially in the last like 10 years, but increasingly today, that idea is often dismantled and sliced and diced in different ways to show that the public can drive foreign policy in certain ways and under certain circumstances, and can formulate opinions independent of the elites. Sorry. Okay. The other, this is, I'm sure you've run into this particular model, the two-level game model. It's a very well-known framework for explaining the relationship between domestic politics and foreign policy, which captures how decision makers have to play the international game, well, play foreign policy at two levels, right? The level one is the international one, where, you know, if you are at the negotiation table in a multilateral setting or a bilateral setting, even, you know, negotiating a treaty, for instance, you know, you are bargaining with this sort of foreign counterpart, but at the same time, whatever you decide there, you will have to go back and sell it to your domestic constituents. It might be your voters, but it's also your legislature, which may need to ratify it. And so, for instance, the JCPOA was something like that, right? It had to be ratified periodically in Congress, and at some point, President Trump at the time said that he was not going to put this up for ratification, and then you know, U.S. involvement basically expired. So that's another thing that we study in foreign policy, right? How do leaders go back and forth between these two levels? Now moving sort of closer to the level of the individual, another sort of research area in this field is on political leadership, these individuals, right? How do individual leaders shape foreign policy? This is one of my favorite anecdotes to share. This is, I think this is like 2008, when Angela Merkel visited Putin. Putin was much less Botoxed by that, you know, 15 years ago. He was thin, and so he owns this Labrador and brings it to the summit meeting in Sochi, Russia, knowing that Angela Merkel has a childhood fear of dogs. I thought this was extremely telling of how Putin operates, and like, look at the facial expressions on these people. So it's so you'll hear a lot from people who study leadership. Leaders matter, and I would have loved to be a fly on the wall of like inside that room, and watch Merkel and how she tried to keep herself composed. The other line of work in political leadership looks at how individual leaders perceive their environment and how those perceptions shape how they act in foreign policy. There are two major approaches to doing this. Number one is the operational code. Is called, this was developed by Alexander George. And the idea here is to profile the individual leaders' instrumental and philosophical beliefs about the world and their place in it. So the operational code method looks at whether any given individual leader is do they perceive the world a fundamentally threatening place or a fundamentally non-threatening place? What do they think about the importance of luck in conducting foreign affairs and things of that sort, or like how much control do they think they have over the course of history. The other thing, one of the sort of the predecessors of this work was done by the Sprouts, Margaret and Harold Sprout, and they call it the man-milieu relationship. So it's not just about the milieu, it's not just about the context of the situation that you're in, it's also about who you are and how that relationship influences the foreign policy behaviors of leaders. The second major approach in political leadership studies is developed by Margaret Herman, who also happened to be my doctoral advisor at Syracuse. And she calls this the leadership trait analysis. And LTA focuses on 7 individual traits called belief in the ability that you can control or influence events, your need for power, your conceptual complexity, whether you see the world in black and white or whether you see sort of nuances and I guess different shades of gray, self-confidence, in-group bias, distrust of others, and whether you are task-focused, whether you are driven by problem-solving or by relationship building and maintaining loyalty of those around you. And so both for the operational code analysis and for leadership trait analysis, what we use is spontaneous remarks of the leader. And so, for instance, you will see the leader might take the podium and deliver a prepared statement, but then they might take a few questions, and how they answer those questions matter for understanding their operational code and leadership traits. Or similarly, they go on, let's say 60 Minutes, it's an unscripted interview, right? They might have the questions delivered to them prior, but it's essentially a semi-structured interview. And so how the leader responds in that interview, that's our data, right? And so we do sort of computerized content analysis at the end of the day to capture some values on these traits. And based on those values, we can construct leadership profiles and make predictions over how leaders might be behaving in the future. LTA can also be used to develop hypotheses. So especially if you're interested in writing theses, this is a fun project. This is a fun method to use in a research project. I had a student of mine who actually used this method and wrote a thesis on Islamic leaders and what happens to their worldview with respect to the United States before and after they get elected. And so in a similar sort of hypothesis developing project, a German researcher, Klaus Brümmer, asked whether fiasco prime ministers exhibit certain extreme values on some of these traits. So leaders who are prone to making failed decisions, or I should say leaders who are prone to causing foreign policy failures, or what we call fiascos, do they exhibit certain traits at higher levels than others? And lo and behold, he finds that leaders who are high in self-confidence, going back to the LTA methodology, and leaders who have a higher inclination for resorting to conflictual strategies in foreign policy, going back to this operational code methodology, he finds that these types of leaders who exhibit these extreme values on these variables, on these traits, are more likely to commit foreign policy failures and end up in fiascos. So these are some of the fun projects that you can work on. More recent work looks at what we call micro foundations of foreign policy. So sort of delving deeper into this personality, psychological predispositions, and how those predispositions shape how we act or how leaders act in international relations. This book by Karen Yarhi Milo, she she won a foreign policy best book award from the FPA section at ISA a couple of years ago, and it's a great book. I highly recommend that if you can get a copy. I don't know if we have one in the library, but I highly recommend that you check it out. And it focuses on this idea of self-monitoring. Self-monitoring has to do with I shouldn't say an obsession, but intense awareness of and attention to how others see you. Yeah, so some of you, I guess we are all in some ways self-monitors, like we care about how other people think about us and how other people see us. High self-monitors are especially interested in how they come across to other people. And so Yarhi Milo argues that high self-monitors, especially, she's focusing on US presidents. High self-monitors are more likely to fight to demonstrate reputation for resolve, which means these leaders who care intensely about how they come across as a world leader, they want to demonstrate their resolve, or they want to build a reputation for, looking as resolved or sort of being resolved leaders. And these types of leaders are more likely to engage in wars to demonstrate their reputation for resolve than low self-monitors. And for instance, she finds that Bill Clinton was particularly fit this definition, or fit this sort of argument. All right, let me take another question break. So I know a couple of you guys had your hands up.
I've got order as next.
Go ahead.
Lindsay Capsino.
Okay.
I actually now have two questions, but I will just ask the more relevant one now. Going back to your leadership trait analysis, would you be able to then possibly say, if Obama was still president when COVID hit, how would he react differently to COVID than Trump did? Is that a possibility to use, or is that kind of outside the scope?
That's a good question. So you cannot, well, I guess you can make informed predictions, or I guess you can do that, but it wouldn't be solid empirical research, because it's something like, it's a counterfactual almost, right? Like if it wasn't Trump and it was someone else, would we have, what, 500,000 deaths, right? So it's you can make a sort of an informed, I have too many sort of thoughts racing in my head right now. Short answer to your question is, you cannot study that empirically, because that never happened. But the other side of this is, like, there's something called a counterfactual analysis, which is, if you can find a case where Obama dealt with a similar pandemic, like Ebola, for instance, right? And then you can compare Obama's Ebola response to Trump's COVID response, but that would still be difficult to compare, because Ebola was not a pandemic in the United States, right? Whereas COVID was. So that would be difficult to compare empirically. Like I said, like you can, it would be an opinion piece, like an informed opinion piece that might rely on some preliminary analyses, but it would not be a solid sort of empirical test of anything, because again, like Obama did not deal with COVID. It was Trump. Does that make sense?
All right, thanks for that question. Next I have Kyle Bell.
Yeah, I have a question about Ukraine.
Hmm.
So as you know, the Ukrainians want to join the EU and NATO.
Mm-hmm.
But with the Russian invasion kind of seems like a good opportunity for the EU to fast track membership into the EU. But so far they haven't done that. I'm just wondering, why do you think that is? And also, do you think that Ukraine will eventually get integrated into the EU and into NATO?
EU maybe, NATO I don't think so. Not in the foreseeable future. Absolutely not. It's a huge security risk for NATO, and I don't think it's I don't think it's a possible. But that I mean that's just my personal sort of scholarly opinion, right? As far as EU, like you can fast track, but then you would also have to let go of 60, 70 years of precedence over how EU accession takes place. And once you open the gates to a fast track EU membership, then it's going to create a lot of headache for the EU when it comes to countries like Morocco, when it comes to countries like Turkey, who, especially Turkey, but also, you know, others like, you know, across over to the Black Sea, right? Georgia and other kinds of, like, where do you, like, that opens a sort of a Pandora's box on what it takes to become an EU member. So I think Ukraine would probably be faster than Turkey would, like in terms of for several reasons. But the accession is a very long process, like it's a very technical process, and fast tracking that would, like I said, create more sort of legal bureaucratic headaches for the EU than they would want. So probably not in the foreseeable future, no. I hope that's I hope that's answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, and David Zagrafos.
I had two questions. One's just like I don't know it, so I'm asking you, and the other one's a bit more of an open-ended one. But first, why did Turkey, you mentioned this earlier, why did Turkey block Sweden and I think Norway, you said, from the EU?
Finland.
Finland, was that just a personal thing from Erdogan, or is it something else?
No, like it's not personal. It's here's what they thought. Especially Sweden. Finland was kind of the collateral damage there because Finland was less in the sort of, Turkey's claims were mostly regarding Sweden's behavior and not Finland's, but because, you know, they were sort of going up for membership together, Turkey lumped them in the same basket, but then green lighted Finland's membership, and Sweden is still pending for the same reason. So the argument was the following. When Turkey went through this failed coup attempt in 2016, by the same people who were previously, up until like 3 years prior to the coup attempt, were Erdogan supporters and allies for the preceding like 10, 11 years, these sort of allies turned into enemies, and they had infiltrated the military at the time, or by that time, and they staged this coup. Now the coup failed, and a lot of these Gülenists, because they were the followers of this imam, in this fugitive imam, who I don't know if he's alive or dead, honestly, but he lives in Pennsylvania. And the people who follow him, who are his supporters, are called Gülenists. And so a lot of the Gülenists, after the coup attempt, fled to Sweden. And on top of that, there Sweden, according to the Turkish, official arguments, Sweden sympathizes with the Kurdish national cause to the point where, a lot of Kurdish separatists who are, who would be otherwise arrested by the Turkish government, they also fled to Sweden. And so basically for Turkey, Sweden aids and abets terrorists, right? The Gülenists and also Kurdish separatists, the PKK militants. And so over time, and especially during the Syrian war and Turkey's incursion into northern Syria in the last couple of years, these were Turkey's northern Syrian military operations were designed specifically to prevent Kurds from creating a contiguous sort of border canton or sort of this federalist arrangement. And Turkey started engaging in both ground military force and also a lot of airstrikes, a lot of shelling. And Sweden, who is a military exporter, said, we are going to stop exporting Turkey certain, military hardware because they are using the stuff that we sell them over in Syria against the Kurds. And so Turkey's argument was then the following: why should we let you become a NATO ally, and allies will have to defend each other, because that's the whole idea of becoming a NATO ally, right? Mutual defense. How can we trust that you will be coming to our mutual defense when you are also aiding and abetting the same terrorists that sort of threaten Turkey's national security? And so that was the main argument. And they asked for a lot of concessions from Sweden, including changing some of their legal, frameworks surrounding terrorism and who should be charged with terrorism and who shouldn't, and so on and so forth. And I mean, Turkey and Turkish leadership, and that's like the individual personalistic arguments you can say. Erdogan is an extremely pragmatic leader. He will use all the options available to him to reap concessions, and blocking Sweden's NATO membership at a time when NATO most needed to look unified was an excellent opportunity for him to get whatever he can get. And there are some sort of side deals happening with the US with F-16s as well, but that's like a separate story. So yeah, that's a very long answer, but I hope that covers it.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, I'll continue. So now moving from individuals to groups, here I'm really focusing on small decision-making groups, right? President and their advisors, the National Security Council, even university leadership, right? Like you can also talk about like those kinds of small decision-making groups where a few people, half a dozen people or a dozen people come together and they try to sort of come to a decision. Small group dynamics are mostly studied in the context of presidential advisory groups or coalition sort of cabinets, and also sort of interagency debates and so on, in sort of bureaucratic politics and so on and so forth. Groupthink captures this idea that participants may choose not to say their true opinions about certain issues because they want to maintain consensus and they want to conform to the prevailing group position. And so that creates, according to Irving Janis's argument, that creates suboptimal policy decisions because there isn't a healthy debate where all options are being discussed and the best option is pursued. So this is something that some scholars studied in the context of the Iraq War decision, and there are lots of books on this. and I recommend that you look them up. Moving on. Now, this is an interesting argument, and the Janus book, groupthink, looks at the Bay of Pigs episode specifically and how this was a failure because of groupthink. And here we see the president at the time, and his sort of close advisory group, and Janus explains how certain group dynamics really made this group lock into the Bay of Pigs invasion in a way that it was impossible for them to think about alternative ways to at the time to proceed with Cuba. So, for instance, Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General at the time, basically was the whip for JFK, and he shut down all alternative opinions and sort of differences in opinion, while planning the invasion. And so I think it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, sort of afterwards, having learned from all of these, policy failures, Bobby Kennedy, in a similar sort of decision-making group, and they're let's say in the Situation Room, thinking things through. Bobby Kennedy played devil's advocate, right? It's like the complete opposite of what he did in Bay of Pigs. So there are ways in which you can avoid groupthink, and the argument goes like, if you can avoid groupthink, then your decisions will be achieved. The decision-making process will be healthier. Some of the other more recent work on this looks at leaders and advisors in more less from the groupthink perspective, but also from sort of political ideological perspectives. And Elizabeth Saunders, I think she's just her new book on leaders and advisors are coming. I think it's coming out very soon. So you should sort of keep an eye on that if you're interested in that kind of work. Other small group dynamics, sort of models, look at, again, how organizations or sort of groups of people come together and make decision. Graham Allison's major work, called Essence of Decision, focuses or sort of comes up or creates, develops, I should say. He develops these three different models, these three different templates through which we can assess foreign policy decision-making processes and procedures. One of them is the rational policy model. And here, the argument is that the decision makers would sit down, they would put on the table all the possible options that are available to them, policy options that are available to them, assess the pros and cons of each, and choose the path that maximizes their benefits and minimizes costs. And that's the rational policy model. Now, of course, there might be some aspects of decision making that could take this path, that could be done very rationally, but oftentimes the world is a lot messier than that, right? And so he complements this with these two different additional models. One of them is called the organizational process model, which focuses on the bureaucratic procedures, right? So how does the interagency work? How do they intake information? How do they process that information? And how do they contribute to the policy process through this sort of standard operating procedures, SOPs, or like I said, these standardized procedures that feed the information to the decision maker. And then the last thing is the last sort of the final policy model is the bureaucratic politics model, which is also known as government politics model. And This is used most often in foreign policy analysis work because I think the data is easier to access to conduct this kind of analysis. And here, the argument goes that where you stand politically depends on where you sit, okay? And the argument that Allison puts forward is that foreign policy behavior is the result of interagency competition and turf wars between different actors who may be elected officials, who may be advisors, or who may be, cabinet secretaries, right? So for instance, imagine, and don't imagine this actually happened, right? A coup happens in Thailand. Thailand is a major US partner in terms of, military training. So when a coup happens, the Department of State will have a different opinion on what the US response should be than the DoD, right? Because the DoD does not want to get rid of this, military partner that it engages in trainings with. But then the DOS, because it's more about diplomacy and upholding democratic values and promoting, democracies around the world, would want to have a different opinion over how to respond Thailand. Kevin Marsh, and if you take foreign policy analysis with me, you'll read this piece, studies the 2019 decision to increase the number of troops in US troops in Afghanistan, the surge decision. And he puts to he provides a wonderful analysis and overview of who wanted what in the administration. So you look at Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff to Obama at the time. Now I think he's now the ambassador to Japan. So Rahm Emanuel basically said, no, we should not increase the number of troops because that completely goes against the platform that Obama ran on the year prior, right? Obama ran on this platform that he would want to end the forever wars, and he wouldn't want to meddle in the Middle East any further than what we've already had, and so on and so forth. The surge decision would effectively nullify that. And being the chief of staff, that was Rahm Emanuel's position. The DoD, Leon Panetta, at the time he was the Secretary for Defense, he's completely pro-surge because he's the defense chief, essentially. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, he has a similar position. But then you turn to the State Department and Secretary of State, they talk about something completely opposite. They say, no, like we should not increase the number of troops. So that's the kind of dynamic that takes place in government. And ultimately, the US might send, so many troops to Afghanistan, but the kitchen of it is extremely messy. Okay, I'll skip this one. And so finally, all of what we're talking about in terms of what takes place inside the state, between institutions, between organizations and individuals, and how these moving parts are situated in these broader structural constraints or determinants of behavior, right? Geography, your economy, your alliance structures, your capabilities, whether you are resource rich, and so on and so forth. All of those are also complemented by what we call roles, specifically foreign policy roles, okay? And this is maybe at this point, a third or fourth research area in foreign policy analysis. When we talk about role, we talk about how a state considers itself and considers its role to be on world politics. Like literally think of this as a stage, and countries play different roles in world politics, right? So you can think of like Russia as like the disruptor, right? And the US has this sort of superpower role. You can think about it as, you know, a world police role, or you know, whatever that might be. So a state's role in international relations is defined by two things. Number one, how it sees itself. Number two, how others see itself, right? So like when Israel is attacked by Hamas, everyone turns to the United States, right? What is the United States going to do? Like, what is it going to say about it? And so that is a role expectation, right? What role is the United States going to play in this conflict? Or similarly with the war in Ukraine, right? What role does the United States play in that kind of conflict? It's shaped by both what the United States thinks its role should be, but it also is shaped by what others expect the United States to do. Like I said, a state's role in IR is defined by those interactions, the perceptions and expectations, but it's also defined by national characteristics, right? History, tradition, myths, traumas, but also, you know, resources, capabilities, and things like that. All of those feed into what a state's role should be. So let me give you a quick example. And this was studied also academically, and the argument comes from a publication that was published back in 2012. In the run-up to the 2003 war in Iraq, Denmark was one of the first sort of 8 countries that the United States reached out to and said, you know, would you be willing to join forces in this war coalition as we, set out for this military operation in Iraq? Now, Denmark found itself at a crossroads, right? Denmark is a loyal U.S. ally. It's historically has been, and so there is expectations around being a U.S. ally, and so Denmark plays that role. But also Denmark plays the role of a good international citizen, meaning they abide by international law, they respect rules of law, they respect UN resolutions, and they generally want to stay away from conflicts that are not sanctioned by the United Nations. Now, the Iraq War was not sanctioned by the United Nations, as you might remember. Now, that is what we call a role conflict for Denmark, right? What role is Denmark going to play? And so there are competing expectations both within Denmark and from, you know, particularly the European allies. And so ultimately Denmark did contribute to the 2003 war. I'm not gonna you know, bury the outcome. But that was a role conflict. One of the current papers that I'm working on looks at Turkish foreign policy over the Arab-Israeli conflict, and then also in the Ukraine war. And the argument that I'm making with my co-author is that role conflict also leads to foreign policy fiascos. When Turkey played both the sort of the regional mediator role vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also, and continues to do so in some respects, sort of the defender of Islamic faith or regional protector role, especially vis-a-vis Gaza and the Palestinian people, that creates role conflict, especially for the Israeli observers, right? Are you going to mediate the conflict, or are you going to take sides in the conflict? And that basically resulted in the failure of Turkish foreign policy in around 2010, when the mediation process broke down because Israel said, we don't trust you anymore. All right, so ultimately then, what we're doing is really building bridges between different lines of research to explain and understand foreign policy, yeah? So all of the individual leader approaches, group decision-making approaches, the psychomilio predispositions, perceptions, misperceptions, all of those feed from research on political psychology. Whereas the relationship between institutions, party politics, legislatures, how election cycles influence foreign policy, and so on and so forth. All of those speak to comparative politics, which is a major subfield in political science. And so that's a good thing for foreign policy because, you know, it's so rich and it can speak to a lot of different subfields and a lot of different research agendas and programs. But it can also be a curse because it's very difficult if you want to categorize yourself, and the discipline generally enjoys and appreciates when a scholar can be easily put into one of the 4 buckets, right? American politics, international relations, comparative politics, and political theory in the case of US Academy. Foreign policy analysis kind of stays right in between IR and comparative. I find it a strength for me, but it has also been something that stalled my career because I'm neither at the same time. So that's there are professional considerations also in how we do research. So that's something that I wanted to highlight. All right, I want to end with this final slide on methodological debates. A lot of the things that I showed you today and a lot of other things that I didn't show you, but if you take foreign policy with me, you'll find out, is that there's a lot of methodological plurality in what we do. So a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot of, there are studies that focus on case studies, deep archival work, and comparative analyses. You know, you go into the archives, you look at how, you know, how these organizations worked. You might go and do interviews with, you know, former policymakers, current policymakers, if you're extremely lucky. And you can really create a narrative explanation of what happened and why it happened. This means more insights, more granular analysis. You're focusing on the process, different individuals and organizations' behavior. It's awesome, right? But it's also a lot of work because it requires travel, it requires a lot of reading, a lot of data collecting in the archives, ability to conduct interviews and all of that. There's also statistical analysis, which is also something I do. I didn't cover that portion of my research today, but I would be happy to do so later on. And statistical analysis, large N research, where you don't have just like 2 cases or just one case like Cuban Missile Crisis, but you can look at, let's say, all troop contributions by every single country around the world in a particular period of time, right? Like that would mean like a couple hundred, maybe even thousands of, you know, parliamentary decisions on, you know, troop contributions. Then you can study those by, you know, creating quantitative models. What drives these decisions? When are these decisions successful, or sort of when are these bills getting majority yes votes in the parliament? When are they not getting, and so on and so forth. Statistical analysis is great because if you can show over a large number of cases that there's a trend, that there's an association between your independent and dependent variables, that gives you a good understanding of like big picture, you know, what's the trend. And, you know, it's a parsimonious, it's a simple, big picture result. But it loses a lot of the nuance, right? Because, you know, all of those variables and values of those variables that you quantify and squeeze in a spreadsheet, there's like a whole story to how we got there in the first place, right? And so you want to find out also some of that, and case studies can help you, uncover all of that. A third method that we use is content analysis. And so that means, like, especially if you're doing stuff like LTA, what you're doing, leadership trait analysis, what you're doing is you're counting words, right? You're trying to find repetitive words that are theoretically associated with certain types of traits. So for instance, conceptually simple leaders who see things in black and white, are more likely to use words like absolutely, without a doubt, like sort of words that communicate certainty and decisiveness. Whereas conceptually complex leaders will say things like, with some probability, or it is likely that, like, so they talk in more probabilistic terms. And so content analysis would start to sort of read material and count words, count phrases, and try to find patterns between different types of documents, between different leaders, and so on and so forth. The best way to tell a story about foreign policy is to conduct multi-method work, right? Do a combination of these things. But that's, of course, it's extremely labor intensive. It has to be done over long periods of time. But the result is extremely satisfying, because you can show both the big picture. Let's say you do a statistical analysis and you show the trends, and then you say, here are some case studies that really delve into what I just showed you in my regression table. So those things are complementary. And I hope this slide also gives you some idea as to, like, if you work on a foreign policy thesis with me, these will be the methods of choice, right? And these will be stuff that you will need to think about and decide. More recent work in political science, but also specifically in IR and foreign policy, works on experiments. Experimentation is the only way of capturing causality, because what you're doing is you're assigning treatments, or what is it that you want to measure the effect of randomly across. If you're conducting a survey, that would mean across different individuals, and trying to find, because you're assigning it randomly, you're controlling for all these other factors that might drive response, and you are isolating the effect of the treatment, right? Whatever it is that you're randomly assigning to your respondents. And so more recent work in foreign policy analysis looks at either public opinion or elite opinion through surveys, and through introducing experimental interventions, basically experimental questions, and randomly sort of tweaking the question in ways that capture that experimental manipulation. And so one of the papers that I really like that uses this methodology is by Josh Busby and Craig Kafura and Monton and Jordan Tama, who look at how U.S. foreign policy elites think about multilateral approval of military action. And when they are told that a possible military action is sanctioned by the UN, does that change their level of support for that military action, right? So whether other people's blessing changes our opinion about, what we think about this particular military action. And the answer is yes. So they actually manipulate this this multilateral approval treatment, and they find that when the foreign policy elites are told that this military action is sanctioned by the UN, they are more likely to support it. So that's the other thing. All right, I will stop there. And I would be happy to take questions and continue this conversation. But I should, where is my, okay, so that's my email. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have any follow-up questions, or if you just want to sort of bounce off some ideas for a thesis. I'll be happy to help.
All right, thank you very much.